talk about the mechanism of descending from grace into hell or leaving the garden. We begin with a reality that is spherical, that is graceful, that is symmetrical, and that is vastly complex. A sphere is an infinite number of lines, and also the number one. It is one, and it can be refracted into an infinite number of lines. At the sophistication of a high refraction point, when the sphere is broken into a million different lines, there is far more grace than when it is cut in half in a dualistic system. There is an unconscious grace outside of the domain of the human ego. There is an unconscious grace as this dance between the infinite refractions of the masculine and the one of the feminine, between the sphere as one and the sphere as infinite planes and infinite refractions, come together in a paradox, in a unity, in a synergy. Now, as we take that infinite number of lines and downgrade it into language, a heuristic, symbolic doorway back to reality that is not reality, it is a doorway to reality. We only have a doorway to that which we have language for because we cannot think. You and I in this moment cannot think a single thought without language. People that are multilingual actually have to decide which language they're thinking in, or they default to one, or default for one for more emotional things, one for other options. But we think through the lens of language. I am thinking becomes real when we say the words, becomes real to the conscious mind. But what is real beyond the symbol of words is more real than what is real within the representation, within the symbolic language of language and thought. Thought pairing with language, synonymous with language in many ways, intends to create a rendition of the ultimate sphere that is more real, of the ultimate totality that is infinite in its distinctions. And due to the limitation of human thinking and human consciousness, the refraction of the whole is not into a million different lines. It's into very crude sets of often not more than 7 different distinctions, where we have, for example, the distinction of waste, thoughts that we don't know what to do with, feelings that we don't want to feel, sensations that we don't want to be present within our body, truths that we don't want to consider, food that we don't want to smell, food that we don't want to eat, sounds that we don't want to hear. We create a template in language called waste for that which we do not know how to constructively do something with, and we put it outside the boundary. We call it waste. In our culture, we think a lot about capital, and so it's one of our main fulcrum points of how much does it cost, what is the impact on money, because money being a high deity in our culture, a number of things are linked in ranking as a corollary currency to money. We have, for example, within our culture, the idea of being modern and changing things, which has some synonymity, which is somewhat synonymous with sociopathic, because when you see something, you either attune and accept to it, or you change it to attune to you. When you walk into a room and a stereo is playing, you either adjust yourself to the stereo, empathic, or to the people playing it, maybe stepping outside so it's not so loud for you, or just tuning it out or putting in earplugs. Or you adjust the environment to your needs, changing the volumes, unplugging it, complaining to someone that it's too loud, and you change things to you. Empathic, sociopathic. Other-centered, self-centered. When we impose what is modern, the idea of modernity, on our environment, it is sociopathic. There's judgment, that's old. Old is bad. Let's get rid of the old. Let's destroy the old. And let's impose the new. Let us determine that this will be modern, that this will be new. Sociopathic versus attunement to what is and empathic. Now, we also have a refraction into organized religion in our cult. So we have the opposite of the new, that which is dogmatic, that which is traditional. So-and-so said in a book written 2,000 years ago, and we focus on that book. So you have the sociopathic and the empathic relative to the past and what's there. You also have rationality as a key framework of our cult, as you have efficiency. Rationality and efficiencies are high deities within our cult. And you have the cult wound. Now, if we understand the fractal nature of reality, and that in the same way that when we violate the whole by reducing it into the simplicity of language, when we take infinite distinctions and reduce them to the few distinctions we can carry and be present to in our head, we butcher the sphere. We butcher the sphere in the recreation of a heuristic version of reality that is a butchered version of reality that fits within the limitations of human consciousness, as opposed to fitting the nuance, the grace, the intimacy of the ever-changing, infinitely complex version of reality. You have reality, infinite and complex, and you have the heuristic version of reality truncated by language. In doing so, we butcher the whole. Now, at the reduced fractal pattern of the human psyche, we have the totality of our probability field, of our possibility field, and we have the butchered actuality of that probability field as that reality that we are capable of creating through the crudeness of our language. And we cling to the crudeness. We cling to that which we can know, that we can place names on. That is an ice cream sundae. It is not a marmalade. That is a house. It is not a car. We cling to these renditions of reality that we create, that we hover and use to locate, that allows our conscious mind to have something to do consciously with reality. Because, of course, everything and every being throughout time has something to do with reality, has a lot to do with reality, but it is through language that we have a conscious relationship with reality. Consciousness being defined as the brain that relates to reality through the heuristic mirror and butcher image butchered image of reality created in language. It is as if we create a map of the world that can fit within our brain, in the same way that when we create a geographical map of the world, the map is not the brain, or the map is not the reality that is mapped out. The map is simply a rendition. And that's all we have of reality. We have a rendition captured through the lens of the conscious mind that is tracking words and creating thought and images out of those words. That is our version of reality. That is our personal version of reality. Now, in the process of taking the unity of our psyche and descending it into the hell of the conscious mind, we create pain. The pain is the separation from and the longing for wholeness. The pain is a sense of grief that marks the lines that we use to divide ourselves and divide other people. The pain is the sense of separation as we divide ourselves through language in more and more abstract way from more and more parts of reality. That's not me, that's not me, that's not me, I don't belong there, that doesn't belong there. And pretty soon we live within the wall of our own separateness. Even as our energy, our biology, and our environment intermingle constantly through breath, through memes, through culture, through ecology, through food, through water, even as we intermingle consciously and constantly with the larger ecology of our reality, we feel within the prison of language, isolated and separate. And it is in this area that our cult, because every culture is cult-like in its dogma of habits, which from a scientific basis have very little to do with intelligence. If you ask a scientist, why is it that you all drink alcohol and kill your livers but have scheduled psilocybin mushrooms as a drug with no medical research and banned it, and to such a point that you actually lock your citizens up in concrete boxes at a cost of $80,000 a year to prevent them from eating a mushroom? Why is it that you do that when people are dying of liver cancer with alcohol, people are dying on the road with drunken driving constantly at a significantly higher rate than people using medicinal mushrooms? Well, there isn't a scientific answer, there's a political answer. Nixon wanted to break up the left during the Vietnam protests, and going in at psychedelics was one vehicle available to Nixon. So you have a political understanding, but if you look at the underlying science says that alcohol is more dangerous than marijuana, that alcohol has more dangerous social impacts than marijuana. So why is one a Schedule I drug and the other pervade on every street? It isn't a scientific equation. It's a cultural and language equation. We have ideas such as laws. And then we have laws that say that this is a Schedule I drug, even though its safety risks are much lower. So we create our prison in language, and we descend into that prison, into the hell created by our culture. That is self-referencing, which means it's highly protected. Anything that's self-referencing has no threat. Anything that is intelligent must constantly be evaluated in relationship to an objective. If I say I want to live a long and healthy life, and I notice that eating sugar, starches, dairy, all consume to large amounts of obesity, and that eating meats and vegetables and whole grains all create a healthier body, well then you can take action to respond, because you're referencing the objective of living a long life of enjoying one's body. One can do study, but that study takes us outside of ourselves and often outside of the cult. When you are self-referencing, you say, I am the one who eats macaroni and cheese and ice cream and pizza and discovers for some mysterious reason that I'm fat. And I am that person because I am that person, and that's my way of life. And so I've got to protect my way of life. And so I'm becoming completely self-referencing. I am the one that does this. I do this because it's me. It's me because I do it. And I do it because it's me. And who I am is good. And so whatever is me and whatever I'm doing, that's good. When a culture, which is essentially a conversation with itself that says, let's get everyone in our cult to eat these kinds of foods, to have these kinds of conversations, to have these kinds of job relationships, to relate to the environment like this. Everyone's going to have a car. Cars are going to run like this. They're going to have different sides of the road. Everyone's going to learn this language. Everyone's going to read these books. Everyone's going to study the art of making money. And so everyone's on board with that. And yet, there's no one in the cult that looks outside the cult and says, are there happier people? What about a cult that happened before? Or a new cult that could be designed? So as a general rule, a cult or culture is self-referential with a primary goal of maintaining the status quo, and in doing so, protecting people from the unknown, and in doing so, protecting people from the inefficiency of needing to think. It's highly draining and it takes a lot of energy to keep evaluating reality in fresh and new ways relative to multiple values over time. It takes very little energy to say, my dad did this, so I'm going to do that, and he did it because his dad did it, and what's good enough for him is good enough for me, and so let's not talk about it. That's a very easy, efficient way of accepting what is. To actually have to assess and say, well, what is the life expectancy associated with this habit? What is the mental emotional health associated with this habit? What is the amount of child abuse associated with this habit? What is the amount of divorce associated with this habit? To understand that every pattern of behavior produces a different statistical probability field. And that if we want to lose money, go to Vegas and place lots of bets. Because statistically, lots of people can lose money that way. So if you want to lose money, that's a good place to go. If you want to make money, lots of people invest in land, and over time it appreciates in value. So if you want to be part of that statistic, which is more than 75% of people who invest in real estate make money, and more than 98% of gamblers lose money, it gives you a sense of which statistic to join. Cults are not governed by statistical intelligence. They are governed by dogma. The self-referential dogma that says we do it because we do it, and that's good enough for me and don't ask any questions. If you do, you're breaking a taboo. You're shattering the usefulness of cults, which is to help us avoid thinking so that we can relax certain that what happened before is likely to happen again, because if we keep doing the things that we did before, it will probably produce the same results. We can be quite content as we become more and more obese, because we've become more and more obese consistently every decade for decades now, and so we can be pretty comfortable that we will continue to do that because we're continuing to eat the things that are creating more and more morbid obesity. And so that's a reasonable assumption, and we can all relax knowing exactly what to expect, as opposed to, what would happen if people began asking that dietary information be shared in schools or anything intelligent along those lines. The thing to understand is that we do not have consciousness in the way that we think of it without language. We do not have language without words. Words are distinctions, and so the larger our vocabulary, the more complex renditions of reality we can create. The more patience we have with nuance and detail, the more time we take to speak and to listen, the more complex our rendition of reality can be within our conscious mind. As we move towards dumbing down, towards simplification, towards incredibly crude heuristic models of reality that do not have to take account of anomalous data. For example, there's all kinds of theories out there that work pretty well. They're good models of reality 70% of the time. There's other models of reality that are consistent with reality 85% of the time, 90% of the time. But no theory, no version of reality, no version of consciousness of a model of reality created and downloaded through human language can be an accurate map of reality 100% of the time. The reason is simple. If it was that complex, it would cease to be a model, meaning a map of a beach that showed every drop of sand and every drop of water on the beach would be the beach. If the map was complete in its sophistication, it would be the reality. In fact, one could say that through language and through drawn maps, we relate to a version of reality that is bigger than we can comprehend. And we could say that the version of reality that is bigger than we can comprehend is a map of reality. A map that is bigger. A map of a reality that is bigger than can fit within the physical representation of energy. In other words, that if we leave the 5 dimensions of sensory perception and perceive reality through a non-dualistic lens, that the reality that we perceive with our 5 senses is a map for a reality that cannot be perceived through the 5 senses. It may need 100 senses, because senses are doorways to dimension. For example, the dimension of light is trackable through eyes. The eyes are a scientific instrument that measures energy on the dimension of light. The nose is a scientific instrument that measures energy on the dimension of frequency that can be comprehended by the nose. The ears are a scientific instrument that can measure energy within certain frequencies on the dimension of sound. Now, note that we have very few senses. We don't have a sense for a QL, because there is a sense that can detect right angles in geometry. There is a sense that when you look at all the shapes in the world, notices and counts how many right angles there are within the vista of the human eye. There is a sense called a QL. We don't have that sense. We don't have appeal. We don't have the sense that measures proximity on a dimension we cannot imagine. We don't have the sense that measures proximity on the dimension that we can't imagine, because we don't have the sense. That does not mean that the dimension does not exist. It just means it doesn't exist within the conscious rendition of reality that we call reality, but which is really a heuristic map through the lens of language, through the lens of graphical interface. Oh yes, that looks like England. We have been told. I've lived in England for 4 years. Never once has any part of England ever looked like the overview of a map of England. Now, when you get into little coves and things, if you ever blow up the map, you could say, oh, there's that rock over there. It's a pretty blown up map. If you're on Google Maps, you can say, oh, there's that house, etc. And so within virtual reality, what Google's doing with Google Maps, we're turning a 5-sensory reality, which has 500% more dimensions, into a 1-sensory reality through visual interface. We're able to extrapolate through imagination and bring in some of the other senses as we look at houses and forests around the world through Google Maps and, through the street view, where it can take us there and our imagination can fill in the sounds if we see people there, etc. So we create a model of reality that is not reality, but it takes us in the direction of reality. And of course, the benefit of a map that takes us in the direction of reality when paired with the phenomena of free will, meaning that we have the experience of making choices and reality getting better or worse in terms of the efficiency of converting energy into human well-being. As we take steps, it gets more efficient to convert energy into well-being, i.e. we're getting warmer towards grace, towards beauty, towards truth and goodness. We're getting warmer and warmer. And we have other behaviors that take us away. As we find ourselves going higher and higher into credit card debt, for example, it becomes harder and harder to convert energy into well-being because so much is being siphoned off for 25% interest. So it becomes 25% harder for energy to go directly into human well-being. It's going into the well-being of the bankers to the degree that they define money as well-being. The map of the psyche, the map of the cult, the map of human consciousness through language is an incredibly crude, butchered version of reality that is aspiring and evolving in search of beauty, truth, and goodness, in search of the Trinity, in search of the ideal, in search of the garden, to go back to the place before language, where there was no garbage, where everything was infinitely distinct and one, where there was no judgment. This is a bad person, this is a good person. That makes sense within human consciousness, and yet we long to transcend and return to that state of being that transcends, that is bigger than the conscious mind as experienced through language. Now, every cult in human history, every culture in human history has butchered the whole in a different way. Every cult in human history has butchered the psyche of men and women in different ways. This culture says this is the role of women. This culture says this is the role of women. This culture says this is the role of women. This culture says this is the role of men. This cult says this is what a man is. This is what a man is. And they're all slightly different butcherings. The man is strong and silent. No, the man is more emotional and talks about his feelings. No, the man is a bad guy. He's a bit naughty and spices things up a little bit. No, the man is this. The ideal of what it is to be and embody the archetype that is man and the archetype that is woman is changing. After World War II, Chanel brought in the idea of the modern woman, the dispassionate and more masculine woman. The clipped haircut, functionality over beauty. Functionality over beauty. In the tension of masculine and feminine, you have beauty, you have function. You have the function of beauty and the beauty of graceful functionality. And you also have the ideal, the often modern ideal, particularly in the beginnings of modern architecture, etc., where lofts and factories translated into apartments glorified the efficiency, the ugly efficiency of seeing steel pipes and stainless steel this and that running through bricks and that and the other, to say that we will glorify the masculine, the pure functionality, the efficiency, and that will be our beauty, as opposed to adornment for the sake of symmetry, for the sake of aesthetic, simply because it's beautiful. Every cult chops the psyche, chops the world, chops the sphere into a different, crude version of reality that emphasizes different things, a necessity in the framework of human consciousness that cannot hold paradox with complexity, that cannot hold 256 million colors the way that, for example, a computer chip can, but can hold 7 colors, 10 colors, maybe 15 colors. After seeing with your eyes more than 100 million colors, can you name more than 15? Not within our cult, as a general rule, as a statistic. Our cult doesn't raise people who can name more than 15 colors. There are 256 million. But we're not attuned to color, a more feminine, a more aesthetic dimension. We are tuned to other things. We know the difference between 64 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs and how many megabytes this file is going to take. We're interested in the function. We're interested in the technology in many ways. So, our cult refracts the psyche through the heuristic pattern of language, modeling something in language, and then teaches us to relate to who we are and to what is, to relate to the divine, to that which is beyond the self, to that which is the body of which we are unconsciously a part. For example, as an American, I don't feel like I belong to this land. And yet this land is giving me water, and the trees are giving me oxygen. I don't feel the connection because the cult language doesn't connect breathing with the trees around me. Imagine if it did. Imagine if we lived in a cult where, as we breathe the first breath each morning, we bow to each of the directions in which trees are growing. Because within this cult, we honor the interdependency, the interpartnering of the human body and the larger body of which we are a part, the larger body that feeds the human body. Because we honor that, we bow to the living plants in each direction and thank them for the quality of oxygen that we're breathing. We bow to the four directions and thank the rivers and the reservoirs for providing water. That is a part of us, and that we are a part of it. That without that water, humans don't exist. Without humans, the reservoir and the plumbing and the piping doesn't exist. It's an ecology. And yet our cult marginalizes that, and this is the self-referencing selectivity of cults. It can take something as basic as the dance of breath. Every breath a gift from the trees around me. Every breath a gift from the trees around me. And it leaves me feeling isolated and that I don't belong because language shunts my consciousness off in another direction, away from the interdependency with my ecology in a different direction. My cult shunts me to the Forbes 400 list. And it says, are you on that list? If you're not on that list, you don't belong. You're not important. Which is more important, the Forbes 400 list or having oxygen from trees? The truth, the scientific truth, is the oxygen is more important. The cultural truth is that the Forbes 400 list is more important. Because the cult dismisses our interdependency with ecology. It says, okay, everyone has air. You're not special because you have air, but so-and-so has 15 billion and this other person has 100 billion. That means they're even more important, and you're not on that list. And so pay attention to that. Pay attention to the breath and the exchange with the trees outside the door leads to a different set of choices. If you wake up and bow to the scientific reality of our interdependency, then we're more likely to think twice around getting on the Forbes 400 list by cutting down a forest unnecessarily. Because what you acknowledge, what you honor within the cult, determines a large degree of the statistical probability of whether you're likely to do something or do something else. We're given the wound of the cult. And the cult protects itself from change. We are given the wound of the psyche, inherited from our parents. And the traumatized psyche protects itself from change. Because the traumatized psyche's deepest fear is the unknown. Because every trauma has emerged out of the unknown. Every miracle and every trauma has emerged out of the unknown. Miracles are quickly discounted. Traumas, those large forces of energy that overwhelm the human ego, traumas are obsessed over until we find some resolution, some relationship of integration with that intense energy. And so we dwell on the fear of the unknown as a harbinger of trauma, rather than inviting the unknown as a harbinger for 99% of all the beauty, truth, and goodness in the future that will come into our reality will come through the doorway of the unknown, just as it always has. Washer machines came out of the unknown, refrigerators from the unknown, organic sweet carrots Bread for thickness came out of the unknown. Space travel, coming from the unknown. Visions, poetry, dance, Shakespeare, from the unknown. One moment it wasn't there, and then it entered through the humility of opening the doorway to possibility, something that only non-traumatized cultures embrace and cultivate, something that our culture does not embrace and cultivate. The cult refracts reality into a simple version of reality that it can understand. And in doing so, breaks the world up into sections. This is work. This is play. This is success. This is prison. This is this. A few little basic versions of reality. This is your spirituality. This is your work. This is your family. This is your future. This is your education. Is that too complicated? Okay, I can follow that. I can repeat those words, figure out what they mean. So we refract the world into a few small pieces. Having refracted the world into small pieces, we then create environments that represent those pieces. We say, well, to educate people, we need to prepare them for factories. To prepare them to factories, let's send them into a factory. Let's send them into places where they're to do what they're told, where they're lined up and everyone's doing the same thing, and you're asked to memorize things and then do exactly what the boss says. That is a school. It's exactly what's happening in school. It's not a version of reality. It's a version of a factory that is a simple version of energy exchange created within the crudeness of a capitalist cult. So now we have prepared people to go from this model of separation into this model of separation. But it is a model that we understand. It is a model that can be captured within the sophistication of human consciousness. So we have a disposal and waste persona. We have the part of us that feels completely separate. We have the part of us that has some relationship with the divine, either hating it, rebelling it, denying it, dogmatically adhering to the church, having our own path. We have a relationship with that. We have the change maker, the part that's trying to grow and change, cultivated by the cult. We have the capitalist. We have the wound in trauma. We have this domain of fight, flight, and freeze that's constantly interfering in age regression. We have rationality that's in conflict with these things, because the more you make something into a circle, the more you touch things indirectly at an oblique angle and partner in creating the strength of the wheel. The more you break things into opposites, the more you create conflict. The simpler the culture, the more conflict within the culture. And the culture maintains its identity with taboos, with shame, with strategy, with outer context that rewards itself, with secrets. And one of the most important secrets that every cult keeps is the anomalous data that's outside of the line. The anomalous data that's outside of the line. Because every model of reality is simpler than reality. Every reconstruction of reality through language is simpler and cruder than the experience of reality in form. Which is why ultimately every version of human consciousness in language is false. It can take you so far to the truth. At the limits of human consciousness, at the limits of our ability to grok the distinctions of language, we must either abandon reality and stay imprisoned in the consciousness of our language, or we must break the bounds. We must break the bounds. beyond the simplicity of crude language and the consciousness it evokes, and go into the infinite chaos and complexity, the infinite wonder, serenity, vitality, and beauty of a reality that is 1,000,000 times more dimensional than the language that heuristically renders it for human consciousness consumption. 100 million, 1,000,000,000, 1,000,000,000,000 times more complex than the consciousness we have to process it. Because truly so, if we had the processing capacity, because we have a very zoom-in lens as human, beings and egos. If you're paying attention here, you're not fully paying attention to what's going on behind your back. That's how narrow our lens is. And that's just you and me, of all the billions of places. And that's just this planet of all the billions of planets. And that's just this universe of all of the infinite universes. It's a very micro zoom-in lens. So we can only see one thing at a time. So how do you digest 100 million images on a Blu-ray disc at one moment? How do you digest it in a single moment? And not break it up into frame after frame after frame after frame after frame that I watch in this sequence, in this order, and say, oh, this is the story of this movie. The thing to understand is that human consciousness is hell to the degree that we simplify and polarize reality through the lens of language. And that it is heaven to the degree that we add complexity, symmetry, grace, and dimensionality, and to the degree that we adopt holographic, ecological, feminine consciousness in equal partner with the distinctions of the masculine lines called words that divide the infinite color spectrum into one color versus another. You see, because orange doesn't exist until the lineality of the rational masculine mind draws a line at some point in the continuum between red and orange, which is infinite. The continuum between red and orange is infinite. Give me any color wheel, and on that color wheel find something you say, this is orange, and make a point there. And this is red, and make a point there. And then if you measure that point, depending on the size of the color wheel, it might be a foot long. So orange over here, red here. So you say that's 1 foot. But it isn't. It's 100 billion, million, billion, trillion increments if you can count that much. If you can make something a millimeter of a millimeter, a thousandth of a thousandth of a thousandth of a thousand, if you can measure that much, it is that big. Or, if you just want to keep it simple, you say that on that infinite gradient between red and orange, this is red, this is orange, that's good enough for me. I'm comfortable with the detail of my map of the world, even though it's wrong. Even though there are 100 million increments on the transition as red becomes orange, as day becomes night. Is a moment a second? Or can you freeze time and slow it down into 100 million awarenesses within a second? Or can you go through hours of your life with no awareness and say that was just a moment when it lasted hours? That was one moment, but it lasted hours, as opposed to a second that had 100 million distinctions of consciousness, perhaps 100 million thoughts, injected in the space between the second hand going here to here, with time going out vertically, up and down, dream time, expanding vertically rather than horizontally, 1 second, 2 seconds, with 100 miles of driving in between, up and down, through the crosshairs of time, up and down, in the middle of 1 second to another second. What can enter into a moment if we could pause the breath of the universe and go sideways out infinitely? What could enter in that space of the infinite moment? And how humble are we to the infinity of time? How humble are we to the infinity of language, the infinity of thought, the infinity of possibility? As humble as we are correlates with our openness to the unknown. Our openness to the unknown correlates to the sophistication of mitigating and responding and repairing trauma. At some point in the traumatic unfolding of unrepaired pain, consciousness shifts from a growth mentality of exploring and opening and feeling and digesting to a reactive mentality with a primary goal that says, get this overwhelming pain away from me, whatever the price. And the price is not going into the unknown, because every trauma emerges out of the unknown as that which is unconscious begins to become conscious. And the real crisis that we have is what a scientist would call anomalous data. There is no human theory capable of grasping the full sophistication of the multiverse. Period. What this means is that the longer we study reality through a scientific lens, the more sophistication we will introduce into our models. Suddenly we'll start saying, no, it's not whether the arnica plant is or is bad for pain. That's not the question. Is the arnica plant picked in this constellation of the star system good or bad for this type of pain? It's not a matter of does homeopathic medicine work or not in all cases. It's does it work for this person with this belief system, with this type of body, when percussed 20,000 times at this frequency and taken at 3 drops a day, or does it work better here? You get into more and more distinction. It's not a matter of is a battery good or bad. It's is this type of battery charged at this rate good for this phone, paired and designed in this way. Because it's not about the thing, it's about the relationship, and the sophistication matters. USB-C is not the same as an iPad port. They look about the same, it just won't work. And the more we understand sophistication in technology through recreating the pattern of nature, copying nature as procreators. Nature has given us 100 million species, and we're killing them off. But we're creating our version of the reality through the crudeness of language by creating 100 million bags of plastic, each folded in a different way, floating on our oceans. We're creating an abundance, mimicking the sophistication of nature through the crude filter of language to create things that don't work very well sustainably and holographically. Because we're learning. The conscious mind is on a journey of expanding awareness all the way up to the beginnings and edges of the possibility field of language, and then going beyond it. What do you do when you don't have language between these 2 points? And you're dealing with a circle, when you're dealing with a sphere, you cut a part of reality away to frame a version of reality we can hold in our own brain. We can hold this in our brain. We can't hold the 10 million ways that the sphere can be refracted, the trillion ways that this sphere can be refracted, this way, this way, this way, the trillion dots of language, and the interconnected synergistic patterns between one dot and another dot and another dot and another dot. We can't hold that in our consciousness. And so we draw a line between trauma and rationality. And everything that's in between, the gradient of infinite distinctions in between, are violated, are dishonored, are thrust into the shadow of the cult, the shadow of the psyche, into unconsciousness. But they do not cease to exist. They cease to be honored through the neurological lens of human consciousness. They cease to be honored. What is honored is inside the line. And what is dishonored curses us. The old witch, the other, the old relative in Sleeping Beauty was not honored with an invitation into the cult. She was uninvited to the birth, to the christening. And the past at every point, every one of our relatives touches the birth. The environment interacts with what is within the environment, and what is within the environment interacts with the environment. The one creates the other creates the one. When you are created out of a cursed energy, there is a split. The split is the line, because those types of relatives aren't invited to the party. They're not invited to Thanksgiving. They're not invited to Christmas because they have things to say. They have ways of being that do not fit within the line drawn by the cult for that which is desirable. They don't fit. They don't fit, so they are excluded. Those are the things we don't talk about. Those are the shames we don't address. Those are the questions we don't answer. We go to sleep for 100 years. When the obvious question comes up, and we say, don't bring up Uncle Kenny. Whatever you do, don't bring up Uncle Kenny at Thanksgiving. So Uncle Kenny, all that energy that's in the space, goes to sleep for 100 years and becomes the curse in unconsciousness. As part of the energy that affects the equation of the whole is affecting the whole, but we cannot acknowledge its impact. We cannot acknowledge its impact. And we cling tenaciously in the terror of the unknown to a version of reality that we know that is false. We know it's not real, but we cling to it to avoid the terror of the unknown. We know it's not right. Those of us abused by Christian parents know it wasn't Christian, it was hypocritical, and we know it was hypocritical and unchristian for our father to beat us. We knew it was hypocritical, cowardly, and unchristian for our mothers to ignore the beating. We know it was cowardly of this relative and that relative to pretend it didn't matter, that it wouldn't have impact. The entire thing is a fraud. It's a fraud. But it cannot be talked about because there's another dynamic that is also taboo. The dynamic of the alpha bully as just one piece of that you don't challenge the alpha bully, you try and use them for money and protection and stuff, and hopefully they'll bully on your behalf sometimes. So we don't challenge the alpha bully. And we don't talk about not doing that because it's not okay within the abuse system to acknowledge that there's a bully in the system, because bullying is outside the set of acceptable reality. So rather than changing acceptable reality or changing reality to be acceptable, we're just going to pretend it doesn't exist. We're going to put the child to sleep for 100 years until love, until symmetry, and until beauty, truth, and goodness descend and reveal the equation, reveal the mathematics, the denied mathematics of infinite numbers that restore the fragmented rendition of hell into the beauty of heaven. We look at ants, for example, and say, how terrible, they're eating this forest. Or they just stung us and bit us, those horrible ants. And we have a version of reality in which nice little pigeons are good and ants are bad, because we lack the sophistication of training to understand the relationship between the pigeon and the ant, the relationship between the forest and the ant. We have created a simplistic model of reality that looks very nice in Disney. It's just we don't understand the place for AIDS. We don't understand the place for Stalin. We don't understand the place for Trump. What is the role, both within hell and the role in the intersection with a reality that transcends hell, the hell of simplistic human paradigms? We don't understand how the one migrates from garbage and waste into energy and fuel. We don't understand it, and we're terrified of the unknown, so we cling to the line, and in clinging cut ourselves in half, cut every part of our world in half. And we discard that which doesn't fit within the box. This is a part of who I am, but they wouldn't accept it at church, and I'm going to church and I want love and belonging, so I will discard that part. I will hide the porn stash, I will do this and that and the other, and discard the part that doesn't belong here. And my feelings and care for the environment, it doesn't belong in my business meetings, so I will carefully hide the fact that I'm a secret environmentalist while I'm in my business meetings. And that my clients, my personal feelings, people have this idea that somehow the pinnacle of business is to be completely impersonal and dissociative. So could you please take all of your personal feelings and put them somewhere else, because that's what business people do. So could you just throw that outside into the shadow, because we're doing business here. And so even though the feelings will continue, let's pretend as if they're not. And we don't have a place for divine sacred experiences in the church that don't correlate with the Bible. So just throw those out. You had a vision of angels, and the angels said that this bit of the Bible isn't right. Well, that's probably a visit from the devil. Keep the current version of the dogma. Throw out your vision. Throw out your sacred experience. That's not Christian. If you want to be a Christian, believe these bit words over here. If you don't want to be a Christian, believe something else. It's not about the mysticism of your experience. It just doesn't fit there. And your political views, they don't really belong in the Republican Party. They may be intelligent views, they may be accurate, they may be scientific, they don't belong here. Could you put those intelligent ideas in some other party that doesn't exist? Because it doesn't belong over here either. These are our little boxes, and these are the things that we do in our boxes. And so could you just put all the things and truths that don't fit in those boxes outside the cult's parameter? Could you build a wall and throw the garbage on the other side? And then just focus on this area here. And as long as we are primarily a fear-based, i.e. traumatized culture, we will butcher those truths that do not fit within the paradigm of the known to protect ourselves from the terror of the anticipated trauma in the unknown. And we will facilitate more trauma, because to the degree that we butcher reality and exclude large portions of the multiverse and large portions of the psyche, is to the degree that we curse large portions of the multiverse, large portions of the psyche, to the degree that we curse with unconsciousness and dishonor. First, we curse with unconsciousness. The unconsciousness leads directly to dishonor. You cannot attune to that which is unconscious. You cannot attune and respond to that which is unconscious, which means that your relationship with what is unconscious will be a relationship of violation, violating what you are unconscious of. Violating what you are unconscious of is a form of violence, and all violence is mutual, because that which we have made unconscious is a part of ourselves. It is a part of the larger reality of which we are a part, and as we violate it, we violate the part of ourselves that corresponds with that region of reality. We violate that same part within ourselves that we have first violated and cursed with unconsciousness. And the more enemies we create by cursing into unconsciousness, the more we will be frightened by the parts of ourselves that violate us as we violate them. In other words, violence is mutual. When you violate a part of yourself, you violate a part of everyone around you. If you say that you are a shit because you are poor, you have just said that every poor person who has ever been. Now, how do you define poor? Well, I only have $2,000. I'm very poor. Okay, so your definition of poorness is $2,000, and your judgment of poor people is that they are shits. Got it? Yes, that's it. Okay, you have just taken every single human being in the history and timeline of the universe, and then every human being, past, present, or future, who doesn't have more than $2,000, you've decided they're all shits. Well, that has enormous repercussions because it is a violation. It is a violation of a vast degree of complexity. What about a monk who has forsaken all physical goods? Are they shits? You see, it's too simple. It's too simple. I don't have $2,000, therefore I'm a shit. I'm violating vast regions of my own psyche. I'm violating vast regions of the psyche of others, and that's just what's happening. So, the return to heaven, the ascent, is in two forms. One is transcendent consciousness, psychedelics, meditation, tantric lovemaking, joy. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi and his book on flow, bliss, total immersion. One form is transcendence. The other form is growing complexity, refracting the personas of the psyche into more and more complex forms, understanding the mythologies from multiple cultures, because each archetypal form in every cult has held a position at the table of self. that is round but is refracted down to the complexity of the mythology. That's why a Hindu religion with maybe 1,000 deities, and temples of the rats, temples of the monkeys, temples of... The more you can refract the world into deities that are sacred, the more sophisticated one's archetypal vocabulary, the more sacred the world becomes. The more sacred the world becomes, the less that is left out. The less that is left out, the less that is unconscious. The less that is unconscious, the less that is cursed. The less that is cursed, the less that we violate. The less that we violate, the less that violate us. When we violate some part of ourselves, that part violates some part of us. Because the part of us that violates that part of ourselves is faulty. It must be changed in order for us to go home. Because to go home is to return to the place that we began and know it for the first time. To go home is to restore the sacred circle, understanding that the lines that we draw to define ourselves are also keeping parts of ourselves out, and that they are buttery, they are soft. That anomalous data is always the harbinger of new complexity. That anomalous data is not something to be jeered, not something to be run out of town, whether it's witches, psychedelics, extraterrestrials, traveling into space, inner consciousness. That anomalous data is the harbinger of a more sophisticated paradigm capable of holding more of the truth within its bounds. Beauty, truth, and goodness is the infinite sphere. Every bit of anomalous data challenges us to expand the line to include the anomalous data. Now, we resist the anarchy of chaos. And so the current ganging up process is that every scientist in the book gangs up on new theories until they can replace the current model with reality with a more sophisticated version of reality. And it is the protection of order. It is the protection of order. I don't want to be in unconscious chaos. I have created a crude and somewhat workable hellhole of a reality through my conscious mind by using this map that works. And I'm not going to throw it out until I have a better map. Now you're pointing out the fact that there's an infinite number of lines between orange and red, an infinite number of distinctions. I can't deal with an infinite number of distinctions, and so this is going to remain orange, and it is going to remain red because I can deal with that. And I'm not giving that up until I have another map of reality that I can deal with better than this form of reality. I'm not giving it up because it's my protection from the fear of the unknown. And so you have visions, you had this and that and the other. I don't know how to fit that into my version of reality. You are threatening the safety provided by the order that has been hard-won through the crudeness of human consciousness over time. You are threatening that, and you are not providing an alternative. You're saying you don't know. Well, I'm saying I'm going to violate your data. I am going to throw it back outside the wall until a solid consensus can be built that is able to include your data and not throw us into chaos. Got it? And so you have a phenomena where the majority, in this case the majority of scientists, let alone the majority of politicians and cult leaders, the majority of scientists are always wrong. Because a square leaves out a lot of waste in the sphere. It does exist. You can make a square and have all this interesting material inside the square, and you can create a 4-point distinction model of reality. It just leaves out a lot. It leaves out all the other dimensions. And it leaves out the bits that don't fit into the square. So we struggle with this. The instinctive fear of the unknown, the fact that every one of us knows that we've had experiences or that friends of ours have had experiences that don't fit into the model of reality that is acceptable to our cult. The awareness that we need to hold on as a cult to some pattern of reality or thinking about reality that makes us feel safe, even if it's wrong. That we need to hold on to some way of thinking about reality that makes us feel safe. What does that mean? It means that it gives us a protection from the unknown. We've got to do it. And so you have all kinds of scientists who have mystical experiences on their own, etc., but they would never bring that into their science. Because the belief is that science, and it is, will in time have a model for understanding reality that can include all this data. But until it does, we can't have the paradigm of science threatened by all of the data that it leaves out, which is enormous. It's worth noting that in the history of humankind, 99.9% of all data has not only been unknown, but unknown. We're dealing with a speck of a speck of a speck of a speck of a reality that we say we know this. And from that little piece, we're trying to understand the whole. And given the fractal and holographic nature of reality, we can, but up to a point. And beyond the point, in that infinite domain that transcends language, we can know nothing. Certainly not within the paradigm of language. We can at best transcend for moments and remember that there is something bigger than we are. At best, we can have the language to say that there is something bigger than language. Now, there are many things that can be captured with language. That which is bigger than language cannot be captured in language. It is bigger than the set, referencing set theory. All of this to say that we are conscious beings who have descended into the hell of our cult, into a butchered, botched, asymmetrical, clumsy, and diseased version of grace. And that our pain is the guide to what we have violated within ourselves and in others, that our pain is the guide to what we have violated. And that pain and joy and beauty, truth, the sense of goodness, that our ideals are leading us back to the mathematical perfection of the sphere. They're leading us back there, step by step, pain by pain, clumsy misstep by clumsy misstep. We return to the place where we began and know it for the first time through the lens of language. A language that can take us to the point perhaps where we can conceptualize the circle and embrace the circle as an idea. And through that embrace, take the full step out into thin air and step with a transit into another version of reality, more sophisticated, more graceful, more elegant than our own. It's been a pleasure.